William Martinez stood at the kitchen window of his small apartment, watching the morning rain streak down the glass. The coffee in his hands had grown cold 20 minutes ago, but he hadn't noticed. His mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying the conversation from last night that had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about his life. At 32, William had built what most people would consider a successful life. He worked as a software engineer at a respected tech company, owned his apartment in a decent neighborhood, and had maintained the same steady relationship with Catherine for 3 years. Everything was predictable, safe, and exactly as he had planned it would be when he graduated college a decade ago. But predictable had started to feel suffocating lately. The same morning routine, the same drive to work, the same conversations with the same people. Even his relationship with Catherine had fallen into a comfortable but uninspiring rhythm. They met for dinner every Tuesday and Friday, spent Saturday nights watching movies at his place, and attended her family gatherings on Sundays. It was nice, stable, and completely devoid of any real passion or excitement. William set down his cold coffee and reached for his phone. 3 missed calls from his mother, 2 text messages from his boss about a project deadline, and nothing from Catherine. That wasn't unusual. Catherine was never much of a morning person, and she rarely reached out first anyway. Their communication had become as routine as everything else in their relationship. The rain outside was picking up, and William realized he was running late for work. He grabbed his jacket and laptop bag, locked the apartment, and headed down to the parking garage. As he drove through the wet streets, he found himself taking a different route than usual. Instead of the highway, he wound through the older part of town, past the small coffee shop where he and Catherine had their first date, past the bookstore where they used to spend hours browsing together. When had they stopped doing those things? When had their relationship become a series of scheduled meetings rather than spontaneous adventures? William couldn't pinpoint exactly when the shift had happened, but somewhere along the way, they had stopped being lovers and had become more like business partners managing the logistics of shared life. At work, William settled into his cubicle and tried to focus on the code he was debugging, but his concentration kept drifting. His colleague Jake stopped by around 10 with news about his weekend hiking trip, showing photos of mountain vistas and talking excitedly about the challenge of the climb. William found himself envying Jake's enthusiasm, wondering when he had last felt that excited about anything. "You should come with me next time," Jake suggested, noticing William's interest in the photos. "There's this amazing trail about 2 hours north. The view from the top is incredible." William considered it for a moment before reality set in. "Catherine's not really the hiking type," he said automatically. "So go without her." Jake shrugged. "It's just a day trip." The suggestion hung in the air long after Jake returned to his desk. Go without her. Such a simple concept, but it felt revolutionary to William. When was the last time he had done something just for himself, something Catherine wasn't interested in or wouldn't approve of? Lunch came and went without William really tasting his sandwich. He was thinking about a conversation he'd had with his college roommate, Marcus, a few months ago. Marcus had quit his corporate job to start a food truck business, despite everyone telling him he was crazy to give up a steady paycheck. The last William heard, Marcus was happier than he'd ever been, even though he was working twice as many hours for half the money. "Life's too short to spend it doing things that don't make you come alive," Marcus had said during their phone call. At the time, William had thought it was just Marcus being dramatic. Now, he was starting to understand what his friend meant. The afternoon dragged by slowly, each line of code feeling more meaningless than the last. William found himself checking the clock every few minutes, not because he was eager to leave work, but because he was dreading going home to another evening of routine. Catherine would come over around 7. They would order takeout from one of their usual 3 restaurants, watch something on Netflix, and go to bed by 11. The same pattern they followed every Tuesday. When 5 o'clock finally arrived, William didn't head straight home as usual. Instead, he found himself driving to the park where he used to run in college. He hadn't been there in years, but something pulled him there today. He parked and walked along the familiar path, remembering how running used to clear his head and make him feel truly alive. An older man was feeding ducks by the pond, and William stopped to watch. The man noticed him and smiled. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" he said, despite the earlier rain clouds still lingering overhead. "It is," William agreed, surprised that he meant it. When was the last time he had simply stopped to appreciate a moment like this? "I come here every day," the man continued. "My wife used to say I was wasting time, just sitting by the water. But after she passed last year, I realized she was wrong. This isn't wasted time. This is life. The real stuff happens in these quiet moments, not in the busy rushing around we do most days." The man's words hit William harder than expected. He thanked the stranger and continued walking, but the conversation stayed with him. How much of his life was he spending rushing through routines instead of actually living? By the time William got home, it was already past 6:30. His phone showed 2 missed calls from Catherine, and he could hear his neighbor's television through the thin walls. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman next door, was watching one of her evening game shows. She had lived alone for as long as William had known her, but she always seemed content, always had a warm greeting when they passed in the hallway. William knocked on her door, something he had never done before. "William, dear, what a nice surprise," Mrs. Henderson said, opening the door with a bright smile. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," William said, then paused. "Actually, can I ask you something? You always seem so happy, living here by yourself. Aren't you ever lonely?" Mrs. Henderson invited him in for tea, and they talked for an hour. She told him about her late husband, about the dreams they had shared, and the one she had pursued after his death. She had learned to paint at 60, traveled to Europe for the first time at 70, and had just started taking piano lessons at 78. "The secret," she said as William was leaving, "is not to wait for life to happen to you. You have to make the choice to really live every single day." William returned to his apartment just as Catherine was arriving, looking slightly annoyed at his absence. "Where were you?" "I tried calling," she said, following him inside. "I went for a walk in the park," William replied, realizing how strange that must sound to her. They never went for walks together. Catherine looked at him suspiciously. "A walk? You hate walking. Remember when I suggested we walk to that new restaurant last month, and you insisted on driving?" She was right, of course. The old William did hate walking, or at least he thought he did. But today's walk had felt different, necessary somehow. They ordered Chinese food and settled onto the couch to watch a medical drama Catherine had been following. William found himself studying her profile as she focused on the screen, really looking at her for the first time in months. Catherine was undeniably beautiful, with her long brown hair and expressive eyes. But when was the last time those eyes had lit up when she looked at him? When was the last time they had talked about anything that mattered? "Catherine," William said during a commercial break, "are you happy?" She turned to him with a confused expression. "What kind of question is that?" "Of course I'm happy. We have a good thing going here, William. Why would you ask that?" But her answer felt automatic, rehearsed almost. William wondered if she had ever really considered the question, or if she, like him, had simply accepted their comfortable routine as happiness. The rest of the evening passed as it always did, but William felt like he was watching it from outside himself. Catherine talked about her day at the marketing firm where she worked, complained about her coworker Sandra, who was always trying to take credit for other people's ideas, and mentioned that her sister was getting divorced again. "I'm glad we're not like that," Catherine said, curling up against William's shoulder. "All that drama and uncertainty. We know what we want, and we have it. But did they?" William stared at the ceiling after Catherine fell asleep beside him, wondering when knowing what you want had become more important than wanting what you have. He thought about Marcus with his food truck, about Mrs. Henderson learning piano at nearly 80, about the man feeding ducks who had learned to appreciate quiet moments. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, William carefully extracted himself from Catherine's embrace and walked to the kitchen. He made himself a cup of tea and stood again at the window, but this time he wasn't just staring mindlessly. He was thinking about all the paths he hadn't taken, all the dreams he had set aside in favor of security and routine. He had wanted to travel after college, maybe teach English abroad for a year or two. Instead, he had taken the first job offer that came along and settled into a life that looked successful from the outside but felt increasingly empty from the inside. He had once loved photography, spent hours capturing interesting angles of ordinary objects, finding beauty in unexpected places. His camera had been sitting in a closet for 2 years now, gathering dust along with that part of himself. He had dreamed of writing, maybe not novels, but at least articles about technology or travel or the things that interested him. Instead, he spent his days writing code that made other people money and his evenings too tired to write anything meaningful. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, William made a decision. He was going to start saying yes to things that scared him, things that interested him, things that made him feel alive. He didn't know exactly what that meant yet, but he knew the comfortable numbness he had been living in wasn't really living at all. Catherine stirred as he slipped back into bed, mumbling something about the early morning. William looked at her peaceful face and felt a complex mix of emotions. He cared about her, he really did. But he was beginning to realize that caring about someone and being truly compatible with them weren't the same thing. The alarm would ring in 3 hours, and William would begin another day. But for the first time in years, he wasn't dreading it. Today felt different, full of possibility. He had no idea that by evening, everything he thought he knew about his life would be completely turned upside down by words Catherine hadn't even spoken yet. William finally drifted off to sleep just as the sun was rising, his last conscious thought being a strange sense of anticipation, as if his life was finally about to begin. The next morning arrived with an unusual energy that William couldn't quite explain. Despite having slept only 3 hours, he felt more awake and alert than he had in months. Catherine had left early for a breakfast meeting with a client, giving him a quick kiss on the forehead before rushing out with her coffee and laptop bag. William took his time getting ready for work, actually looking at himself in the bathroom mirror instead of just going through the motions of his morning routine. When was the last time he had really seen himself? The man looking back at him seemed older than 32, not physically, but in his eyes. There was a weariness there that went beyond the lack of sleep, a resignation that he was only now beginning to recognize. On impulse, William called in sick to work. He had dozens of accumulated sick days and couldn't remember the last time he had used one when he wasn't actually ill. His supervisor seemed genuinely surprised, reminding William that he had perfect attendance for the past 2 years. "Take care of yourself, Martinez," his boss said. "You never take time off. We'll manage without you for one day." After hanging up, William felt a rush of something he hadn't experienced in years. Freedom. He had an entire day ahead of him with no obligations, no meetings, no deadlines. The sensation was both exhilarating and slightly terrifying. He decided to start with something simple. William drove to the camera shop downtown, a small family-owned store he had noticed countless times but never entered. The elderly proprietor, Mr. Chun, greeted him with enthusiasm when William mentioned he was interested in getting back into photography. "Film or digital?" Mr. Chun asked, leading him through the store's narrow aisles lined with equipment. "I used to shoot film in college," William said, running his fingers along a vintage camera body. "But I suppose digital is more practical now." Mr. Chun shook his head with a gentle smile. "Practical, yes, but film teaches you to really see. Each shot matters when you only have 36 chances. Digital makes us lazy, taking hundreds of photos and hoping one is good." William found himself drawn to a simple 35mm camera, not unlike the one he had sold years ago, when he decided he needed to be more realistic about his hobbies. Mr. Chun loaded a roll of black and white film and spent 20 minutes explaining the basics, treating William like a complete beginner despite his protest that he used to know all this. "Knowledge in use becomes forgotten," Mr. Chun said wisely. "Better to start fresh and remember slowly." Walking out of the shop with the camera bag slung over his shoulder, William felt like he was carrying a piece of his younger self. He spent the next hour wandering downtown, not taking pictures yet, but simply observing. He noticed things he had walked past hundreds of times without seeing. The way morning shadows fell across the brick facade of an old building. How a homeless man carefully arranged newspapers as a makeshift pillow. The concentration on a young mother's face as she taught her toddler to navigate the steps outside the library. Around noon, William found himself at Jake's favorite coffee shop, the one he had mentioned wanting to try, but never had time for. The barista was a young woman with purple hair and multiple ear piercings who made coffee with the same intensity and focus that William applied to debugging code. "First time here?" she asked, noticing how long William took to study the menu. "Yeah, I work downtown, but somehow never made it in before today." "Let me guess," she said with a knowing smile. "You always meant to try it, but kept going to the Starbucks across the street because it was faster?" William laughed, surprised by her accuracy. "Exactly. I see it all the time. People get trapped in their routines. They walk past here every day looking curious, but stick with what they know." She handed him a cappuccino with an intricate foam design. Life's too short for mediocre coffee. The coffee was indeed exceptional, rich, and complex in a way that made William wonder why he had been settling for chain store mediocrity for so long. He found a small table by the window and watched people hurry past on the sidewalk outside. Everyone seemed to be rushing somewhere important, checking phones, focused on destinations rather than the journey. A woman at the next table was reading a worn paperback novel, completely absorbed in whatever world existed within those pages. She had to be close to 70, with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes, but her engagement with the book was youthful and passionate. When she finished a chapter, she actually sighed with satisfaction before carefully marking her place with a leather bookmark. "Good book?" William asked impulsively. She looked up with bright eyes. "Wonderful book. I'm reading it for the 4th time, and I'm still discovering things I missed before." "What's it about?" "A woman who decides to change her entire life at 65, she said, holding up the cover. "Leaves her comfortable but boring marriage, moves to Italy, learns to cook authentic cuisine." Fiction, of course, but it makes me think about all the things I keep saying I'll do someday. Do you think people really do that? Just completely change their lives? The woman considered the question seriously. "I think some people do, and others just dream about it until it's too late. The difference is usually one moment of clarity, one realization that staying the same is scarier than changing everything." William thanked her and left the coffee shop with her words echoing in his mind. One moment of clarity. Was that what he was having? This growing sense that his carefully constructed life was actually a prison of his own making? He spent the afternoon at the art museum, another place he had always meant to visit. The permanent collection included photography exhibitions, and William found himself standing for long minutes in front of images that captured single moments with such power and emotion that they told entire stories. One photograph particularly struck him. A street scene from the 1960s showing an elderly man sitting alone on a park bench, feeding pigeons while the city rushed around him. The man's face showed such contentment, such presence in that simple moment, that William felt a physical ache in his chest. When was the last time he had felt that present, that genuinely peaceful? As the museum was closing, William realized he hadn't thought about work all day. Usually, even on weekends, some part of his mind was processing code problems or worrying about deadlines. Today, for the first time in years, he had been completely present in each moment. The drive home took him past the park where he had walked the previous evening. On impulse, he pulled over and grabbed his new camera. The late afternoon light was golden and warm, casting long shadows across the grass. William loaded the film and began shooting, not thinking too much about composition or technique, just capturing moments that caught his eye. An old man was indeed feeding ducks again, though William couldn't tell if it was the same person from yesterday. A young couple sat on a blanket sharing takeout containers, laughing at something on one of their phones. Children played on the playground equipment while their parents watched from benches, and a jogger paused to stretch against a tree, her face serene with the runner's high William remembered from his college days. Each click of the shutter felt significant, like he was documenting not just these scenes, but his own reawakening to the world around him. When the roll was finished, William sat on the same bench where he had talked to the duck-feeding stranger and tried to understand what was happening to him. It wasn't that he suddenly hated his job or his relationship with Catherine. It was more that he was remembering who he used to be, or perhaps discovering who he had always been underneath the layers of routine and responsibility he had wrapped around himself. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine, running late tonight. Don't wait up for dinner. Normally, this would have prompted William to order his usual solo meal and spend the evening watching television or catching up on work emails. Instead, he found himself driving to the grocery store with no particular plan in mind. In the produce section, William struck up a conversation with the clerk, a teenager named Marcus who was enthusiastically describing the difference between various apple varieties. His passion for something as simple as fruit was infectious, and William found himself buying ingredients for a meal he had no idea how to prepare. You should try cooking them with rosemary and garlic, Marcus suggested, helping William select the best apples. My grandmother taught me that. Makes the whole house smell amazing. William had never cooked with rosemary in his life, but he bought some anyway, along with ingredients for what he hoped would become some kind of pasta dish. The act of grocery shopping with actual intention, rather than just grabbing convenient items, felt like a small rebellion against his usual efficiency-focused approach to everything. Back home, William spent 2 hours in the kitchen, consulting YouTube videos and cooking websites, making mistakes, and starting over, creating a mess that would have horrified his usual organized self. But the process was surprisingly meditative, requiring his full attention in a way that felt both challenging and relaxing. The final result was far from perfect, but it was his, created from scratch rather than ordered from a familiar menu. The rosemary did indeed make the apartment smell amazing, and the simple act of eating something he had made himself felt like a small victory. As he was cleaning up, Catherine returned home earlier than expected, stopping in the doorway of the kitchen with a surprised expression. "What's all this?" she asked, taking in the unfamiliar cooking implements, the lingering smells, the satisfied expression on William's face. "I tried cooking something new," William said, suddenly, aware of how unusual this must seem to her. "I called in sick today and ended up having quite an adventure." Catherine's expression shifted to concern. "You called in sick? Are you feeling okay?" "You never call in sick." "I'm feeling fine. Actually, I'm feeling better than I have in a long time." She studied his face as if looking for signs of fever or delirium. "What kind of adventure?" William told her about the camera shop, the coffee, the museum, the cooking experiment. As he spoke, he watched Catherine's expression grow increasingly puzzled, as if he were describing activities undertaken by a stranger. "That's very random," she finally said. "Is this some kind of midlife crisis?" "Because you're only 32, William." The way she said it, as if his desire to try new things was a symptom of a disorder, made William pause. Would it be so bad if it were? Would it be terrible if I wanted to shake things up a little? Shake things up how? Catherine's voice carried a warning tone that William had never noticed before. "We have a good thing here. Stable jobs, a nice apartment, plans for the future. Why would you want to mess with that?" Plans for the future. William realized he couldn't clearly remember making any plans with Catherine that extended beyond their next scheduled dinner or the holiday party her company threw every December. Their future seemed to consist mainly of more of the same, indefinitely. "I'm not talking about messing anything up," William said carefully. "I just think maybe we've gone a little too comfortable in our routines." Comfortable isn't bad, William. Comfortable is what most people work their whole lives to achieve. They went to bed that night without resolving the conversation, but something had shifted between them. Catherine seemed to sense that William's day of exploration represented a threat to the careful balance they had constructed, while William felt like he was seeing their relationship clearly for the first time in years. The next morning, William went to work as usual, but found it impossible to focus on his tasks. The code that had seemed so important yesterday now felt meaningless, and the office environment that had once felt familiar now seemed stifling. During lunch, he developed his roll of film at a 1-hour photo lab, eager to see the results of his afternoon in the park. The photographs weren't technically perfect, but they captured something real and immediate that made William's heart race with recognition. This was what he had been missing, the ability to see beauty and meaning in ordinary moments, to create something personal and authentic. Jake noticed the change in William immediately. "You seem different today. More awake, I guess." "I feel awake," William admitted. "For the first time in years." "That's great, man. What changed?" William wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding like he was having some kind of breakdown. "I think I just remembered that there's more to life than going through the motions." Jake nodded knowingly. Sometimes we need to step outside our comfort zones to remember who we really are. "Speaking of which, you still interested in that hiking trip this weekend?" William didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." The decision felt significant, not just because he was committing to an activity Catherine wouldn't approve of, but because he was choosing to prioritize his own interests and curiosity over the comfortable routine that had defined his life for so long. That evening, as William prepared to tell Catherine about his weekend hiking plans, he had no idea that the conversation would lead to revelations that would change everything he thought he understood about their relationship and his future. The words she was about to whisper would leave him standing paralyzed, forced to confront truths he had been avoiding for longer than he cared to admit. Friday evening arrived with an unusual tension hanging in the air. William had spent the day at work feeling like he was wearing a costume that no longer fit properly. Every interaction felt forced. Every routine task seemed pointless, and he found himself checking the clock constantly, not because he wanted to leave, but because he felt like he was living someone else's life. Catherine arrived at his apartment at exactly 7, as she had every Friday for 3 years. She was carrying takeout bags from their usual Thai restaurant and wore the same expression of mild contentment that had once felt reassuring, but now seemed almost robotic to William. "How was your day?" she asked, settling onto the couch and opening the food containers with practiced efficiency. "Different," William said, realizing he had been giving variations of this answer all week without Catherine really hearing him. "Different how?" she asked, but he could tell she was already mentally moving past his response to plan their evening. William took a breath. "I'm going hiking tomorrow with Jake. There's a trail about 2 hours north that he's been wanting to try." Catherine's hand paused halfway to her mouth, a piece of pad thai suspended on her fork. "Hiking? Since when do you hike?" "Since I decided I want to try new things." "We talked about this, William. These random new interests of yours." She set down her fork and turned to face him fully. "It's like you're going through some kind of phase." "Maybe I am. Maybe that's exactly what I need." Catherine's expression grew concerned, the way someone might look at a friend who was making obviously bad decisions. "This isn't like you. The photography, the cooking, calling in sick to wander around downtown. And now hiking? What's next, skydiving?" The sarcasm in her voice made William realize something he had been avoiding. Catherine didn't just dislike his new interests. She seemed to dislike the version of himself that was interested in anything beyond their established routine. "Would it be so terrible if I did want to try skydiving?" William asked quietly. "Yes, it would be terrible. It would be dangerous and expensive and completely pointless." Catherine's voice was rising slightly. "We have responsibilities, William. We have a life together. You can't just decide to become a completely different person. What if this is who I actually am? What if the person I've been for the past few years is the fake one?" Catherine stared at him for a long moment, and William saw something in her eyes he had never noticed before. Not just confusion or concern, but something that looked almost like disgust. "The person you've been is the person I fell in love with," she said finally. "Stable, predictable, responsible. Someone I could build a future with." The way she said it made William's chest tighten. "You fell in love with my stability? Not with me. Don't be dramatic. Of course I love you, but I love the real you, not this." She gestured vaguely at him. "Whatever this is you're trying to become." William felt like he was seeing Catherine clearly for the first time in their relationship. She wasn't just comfortable with his lack of passion and curiosity. She preferred it. She had chosen him precisely because he was unlikely to surprise or challenge her. What if I can't go back to being that person? William asked. What if I don't want to? Catherine set down her food and moved closer to him on the couch, taking his hands in hers. When she spoke, her voice was softer, almost pleading. William, listen to me. Everyone goes through periods where they question their choices. But you have a good life. We have a good life. Don't throw it away chasing some fantasy of who you think you want to be. Her hands felt cold in his, and William noticed for the first time that her touch didn't comfort him the way it once had. How do you know it's a fantasy? How do you know this isn't exactly who I'm supposed to be? Because I know you, Catherine said with certainty. I know you better than you know yourself right now. This restless feeling will pass, and you'll be grateful you didn't do anything reckless. The conversation continued in circles for another hour, with Catherine trying to convince William that his newfound interests were a temporary delusion, and William trying to explain something he barely understood himself. Finally, exhausted by the futility of it, they went to bed without resolving anything. William lay awake beside Catherine, listening to her even breathing, and tried to understand how they had grown so far apart without either of them noticing. Or maybe Catherine had noticed, but had simply assumed it was his problem to solve by conforming back to her expectations. The next morning, William left for his hiking trip before Catherine woke up. He had packed his camera equipment along with water and snacks, excited about the possibility of capturing mountain landscapes on film. Jake picked him up at 7, and they drove north through increasingly beautiful countryside, talking about everything and nothing in the easy way that had characterized their friendship since William's first day at work. The trail was more challenging than William had expected, requiring concentration and physical effort that left no room for the constant mental chatter that usually filled his mind. For 4 hours, he was completely present, focused only on the next step, the next breath, the changing scenery around him. At the summit, William understood why Jake had been so enthusiastic about the experience. The view was spectacular, but more than that, the sense of achievement felt profound. He had pushed his body beyond its comfort zone and discovered capabilities he had forgotten he possessed. This is what I've been missing, William said as he photographed the vistas spread out below them. What? The exercise? Jake asked, sprawled on a large rock with his eyes closed, face tilted toward the sun. The feeling of being alive. Really alive, not just existing. Jake opened his eyes and studied William's face. You've been thinking about this stuff a lot lately. I've been thinking about everything lately. My job, my relationship, the way I spend my time. William lowered his camera. Do you ever feel like you're living the wrong life? Like you took a wrong turn somewhere and ended up in someone else's story? All the time, Jake said without hesitation. That's why I do things like this. To remind myself that I have choices, even when it doesn't feel like it. They hiked back down in comfortable silence, but William's mind was racing. The physical exertion and mental clarity of the day had crystallized something he had been feeling but couldn't articulate. He didn't just want to add new activities to his existing life. He wanted to fundamentally change how he lived. By the time Jake dropped him off at his apartment building, William had made a decision. He was going to have an honest conversation with Catherine about where their relationship was heading. Not just about his new interests, but about whether they still wanted the same things from life. Catherine was waiting for him in the living room, still in her pajamas despite it being late afternoon. She looked up from her magazine when he entered, and William could see immediately that she had been preparing for this conversation all day. How was your hike? She asked, but her tone suggested she wasn't really interested in the answer. It was incredible. I think I'm going to start doing it regularly. Catherine's jaw tightened slightly. We need to talk. They sat facing each other on the couch where they had spent so many comfortable evenings, but the space between them felt vast now. Catherine had clearly rehearsed what she wanted to say. I've been thinking about everything you've been going through lately, she began, and I think I understand what's happening." William waited for her to continue. "You're having a quarter-life crisis or something. It's normal for people to question their choices when they feel like they're not where they expected to be at a certain age." "Where did you expect me to be?" William asked, genuinely curious. Catherine looked surprised by the question. "Further along, I guess. We've been together for 3 years, William. Most couples would have moved in together by now, maybe gotten engaged." The words hung between them like a revelation. William realized that while he had been questioning whether their relationship had any real passion or connection, Catherine had been wondering why he hadn't proposed yet. "Is that what you want? For us to get engaged?" "Of course that's what I want. Why do you think I've been so patient with your exploration phase? I thought you just needed to get this restlessness out of your system before we could move forward." William felt like he was learning about their relationship for the first time. "You think everything I've been doing this week is just something I need to get out of my system, isn't it?" Catherine's voice was carefully controlled. "You can't seriously think that taking pictures and going hiking is more important than building a stable future together. What if it is, though? What if the things that make me feel alive are exactly what I should be prioritizing?" Catherine's composed expression finally cracked. "That's the most selfish thing I've ever heard you say. Selfish to want to feel passionate about my own life. Selfish to throw away everything we've built together for some fantasy of adventure and excitement." Catherine's voice was rising now, 3 years of suppressed frustration finally surfacing. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to find someone reliable? Someone who shows up when they say they will, who doesn't disappear for weeks chasing some new obsession?" William stared at her, understanding finally clicking into place. "You don't want a partner, Catherine. You want a reliable employee. I want a man who knows what he wants and is willing to work for it instead of constantly second-guessing himself. What if I want has changed? Then you need to figure out how to change it back." The conversation had reached a point where neither of them could pretend they were talking about hiking or photography anymore. They were talking about fundamentally different approaches to life, different values, different definitions of happiness and success. William looked around the apartment that had felt like home for so long and realized it no longer reflected anything about who he was or who he wanted to become. The furniture was safe and practical. The walls were bare except for a few generic prints Catherine had chosen, and nothing in the space suggested that anyone with interests or passions lived there. "I can't change it back," William said quietly. "I don't want to change it back." Catherine was very still for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but the words hit William like a physical blow. "I've been seeing someone else." William stood paralyzed, the words echoing in his mind as he tried to process what she had just said. Everything he thought he understood about their relationship, about Catherine, about himself, suddenly shifted into a completely different configuration. "What?" he managed to say. "His name is David. We work together. It started a few months ago." Catherine's voice was steady now, as if she had been rehearsing this confession too. "He's everything you used to be before you started this, whatever this is you're going through." The room felt like it was spinning slightly. "A few months ago, before I changed anything about my routine." "You've been distant for longer than you realize, William. Physically present, but emotionally somewhere else entirely. David pays attention when I talk. He's excited about planning a future. He doesn't need to find himself because he already knows who he is." William sat back down heavily, his legs suddenly unreliable. "How long? Does it matter?" "It matters to me." Catherine looked out the window as if the exact timeline might be written on the building across the street. "Since February. 10 months. Catherine had been living a double life for 10 months, seeing another man while maintaining their Tuesday through Friday routine, while sharing his bed, while criticizing his attempts to change and grow. "Were you ever going to tell me?" William asked. "I was hoping you'd figure yourself out, and we could get back to normal. But this week," she gestured around the room, buying cameras and missing work and making grand declarations about finding yourself. "You're becoming someone I don't recognize. Someone you don't want to recognize. Someone I can't build a stable life with." The brutal honesty of it was almost refreshing after years of surface-level conversations and unexamined assumptions. Catherine had never loved the person he was becoming because she had never wanted him to become anyone other than who he was when they met. "So what happens now?" William asked. "That depends on you. If you want to go back to being the man I fell in love with, we can work through this." David was just... She paused, searching for the right phrase, a placeholder while you figured things out. William looked at Catherine sitting across from him, still beautiful, still composed, still absolutely certain that her vision of their future was the correct one. A week ago, he might have been devastated by her confession. He might have agreed to change back, to abandon his new interests, to become again the predictable partner she preferred. But now, sitting in his generic apartment after a day of feeling truly alive on a mountain trail, William realized that Catherine's betrayal was actually a gift. It was the final piece of evidence he needed that their relationship had been built on his willingness to remain static rather than any real compatibility or shared vision for the future. "I can't go back," William said, and for the first time all week, he was completely certain about something. "I won't go back." Catherine's face hardened. "Then, I guess we're done." She left that night, taking only her personal items and leaving behind the spare key he had given her 2 years earlier. William sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by the debris of a relationship that had ended not with drama or passion, but with the simple recognition that they had been pretending to love people who didn't really exist. The silence felt profound, but not empty. For the first time in years, William was alone with himself, with no routine to follow, no expectations to meet, no role to play. The uncertainty was terrifying, but also exhilarating. He picked up his camera and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights and thinking about all the photographs he had never taken, all the trails he had never hiked, all the versions of himself he had never allowed to exist. Tomorrow, he would have to figure out what came next. Tonight, he was simply grateful to be awake. The words Catherine had whispered about David, about stability, about William needing to change back, had indeed left him paralyzed for a moment. But the paralysis had broken something in him that needed to be broken, freeing him to finally choose growth over safety, uncertainty over stagnation, authentic living over comfortable pretending. William fell asleep that night, not knowing what his life would look like in 6 months or 6 years, but knowing with absolute certainty that it would be his own.